All right, welcome. This is Drupal as the head in Headless Commerce. And let's see, there we go. I am Kyle Aneker, also known as Control A Dell on Drupal.org, Drupal Slack, and MidCamp Slack, but not on Twitter, unfortunately. I am the Drupal lead at a company called Avianos. When I'm not doing Drupal programming things, I like to spend time outdoors doing backpacking and like long distance backpacking. So I've done a couple trips at 200 miles or so, a couple weeks in the wilderness. It's really where it's nice to disconnect and where I spend my time when I'm not doing Drupal. If you haven't heard of Avianos before, we're an agency that does enterprise level experience management and commerce, mostly B2B commerce, but really any B2C, B2B, B2C commerce implementation, as well as business strategy, integrated marketing, and sales enablement for companies like Cisco, Kellogg's, and Ulta Beauty. Really, we take on challenging projects and we try to make a difference for our clients and drive their business forward, increase their revenues, just help them run their business better. We've been in the Drupal space for a couple of years. We've gotten a couple nominations for Authentication Engage Awards with our Drupal sites. So yeah, that's Avianos. If you haven't heard of us, look us up. We have a couple positions opening and we're definitely hiring. And on to the topic, Drupal as the head. So really, I'm gonna start by addressing the elephant in the room, hence the elephant. And that is that there's this tall Belgian dude that goes to DrupalCons and talks every once in a while. You might recognize him. You might have seen him around. So Dries has been talking for a while, as well as Matt, who spoke yesterday. They've been talking for a while, both of them, about using Drupal headlessly and decoupled, which really raises the question of, if they're saying we should use Drupal headlessly, why would you use Drupal as the head for a commerce system? And the answer is there's a lot of commerce systems out there, right? There's Centauro, which is headless. There's Commerce Tools, which is purely headless. But then there's stuff like Elastic Path, which can be done headlessly. Salesforce, Magento, there's just a lot of commerce systems out there. And not all of them support, headless operation as well as Drupal. They're not all as forward thinking. Some of them think that you should just use what they provide and use them as your front end. And in that situation, Drupal actually makes a lot of sense as the head. And honestly, even though we technically in this room are probably biased towards Drupal, the technology that a business is going to choose is going to come down to a lot of practical considerations, right? For integrations, things like payment gateways, shipping providers, ERPs, PIMs, taxes, marketing automation. These are all things like for a mature e-commerce business, they already have answers to all of these. They already have systems in place. And if they're doing a new commerce site or if they're replatforming, they're not going to want to replatform their entire business. So these often outweigh our technical biases in choosing what commerce system we're going to use. And then there's also back-end functionality, like how their businesses function with customer service, returns, invoicing, user management, account management, and promotions. All these are considerations that a business is going to take into account when they're choosing what commerce system they're going to use. Even if they want to do a headless system, it has to work for their business, or else they're not going to get what they want. And that is why Drupal, the first assumption we're going to make is that Drupal Commerce is not our commerce platform, because life would be too easy if that was the case. So the use case that we're going to look at is a business has decided to do commerce, and they're not going to use Drupal Commerce, but they want to do it headlessly. So they've chosen one that supports headless use is our next assumption. And even though they're happy with the commerce functionality, our business is not happy with the CMS capabilities of their commerce platform, right? They want to have a rich customer experience. They want to have all that marketing material. They want to have the ability for their content authors to really promote their products and get their customers engaged. And whatever commerce platform they've chosen, they've decided it's insufficient for that use case. So we've got a commerce platform chosen. We kind of know what we want. And now the business is looking for a CMS. So why Drupal? And the answer to that, well, there's plenty of talks and blog posts and reasons for why Drupal as a CMS. Drupal is a fully featured, mature CMS. There's no reason not to use it. But in this situation, I think Drupal is in a unique position, a unique value proposition, because Drupal has Drupal Commerce, which is a commerce system with a flexible data model that's really been built to be used, or been built in such a way that it can be used as an integration point for another commerce system. And in the commerce systems I've worked with, the handful of them, I've never seen another commerce system like Drupal Commerce. I've never seen one that's really built in such a flexible way that the data model would support being the front end for another commerce system. And that's really unique. And I think Centauro and Drupal Commerce has done a good job of maintaining that data flexibility that really allows this use case of, well, we have a commerce platform chosen, and now we need to get commerce into our CMS. Just plop Drupal Commerce in the middle. So I think that's a very unique value proposition for Drupal when it comes to doing Drupal as the head in headless commerce, especially against other CMSs. And with that in mind, with that value proposition, we're going to say our business has chosen Drupal as the CMS. So those are our kind of assumptions for our use case. And now we're on to our architecture considerations. We have two systems. How are they going to talk to each other? What does the data flow look like? What functionality lives where? That kind of stuff. So the first real consideration you have to make is authentication. And I'm not talking about authentication of the user. I'm talking about API authentication. So does the commerce platform that's been chosen recommend using an integration user, or does it support customer authentication? And this is a really, really big one, because if the commerce platform only supports an integration user, then your customers cannot interact directly with the commerce API. You have to have something in the middle to store those credentials. Otherwise, you're exposing, essentially a super user for the API to all your customers, and that's just not secure. Whereas if the commerce platform offers has customer authentication, then a customer can directly use the commerce API, and your integration is going to look significantly different because they can talk directly to the commerce system without having to have that middle layer. So that's the first consideration, is authentication for your commerce API. The next one is disconnected behavior. Another way of looking at or saying this is, what parts of the site, or how functional should the site be if the two systems aren't connected together? If Drupal cannot talk to the commerce platform, how functional should the Drupal side be? There are a couple of easy ones to identify here, like user authentication and checkout. If the commerce system owns users and is the identity provider for user authentication, then if they're not connected, a user can't log in. Simple enough. Drupal as the head doesn't have a say in checkout. So like, it cannot say whether an order can transition, or a cart can transition from a cart to an order. So you can't do that without the integration in place. But then there's kind of gray areas. Should your product detail pages still work? I'm of the opinion that yes, you should still be able to browse a product detail page, even if the commerce system isn't connected to Drupal right now. Should you still be able to search? My answer is yes. The business might have another answer. Should catalog and product listing pages still work? I think they should. I think that a user in this system where Drupal is the head and there's a commerce backend, the user shouldn't know if it's not connected until they try to take an action. So product detail pages should be available, search should be available, product listing pages should be available. That's my opinion. Businesses might have different requirements. And then there's two very gray areas in the carting and pricing. So if you're not connected, should you be able to cart something? Well, you could say no, you shouldn't be able to cart something, because what if the commerce system has rules in place that say you shouldn't cart this or this together, or a user can't purchase this for whatever reason? And if you have specific or complicated carting logic, then the answer is no. A user should probably not be able to cart things if they're disconnected. But if you have a fairly simple business model, right? If you're selling online products, you know they're always going to be in stock. You don't have all that many access checks or all that much logic around adding to cart, then sure, let them cart it and let Drupal and the commerce system figure it out once they reconnect. And the same goes for pricing. If you have a simple pricing model that doesn't change that much, if you don't have that many like B2B pricing rules for different accounts and different users, then import, your base price, your list price, and just show that, and then let Drupal and the commerce system handle it after they reconnect. Now, obviously, a user is going to hit a point where they can't continue in this process, right? So even if they can cart and they are seeing a price, if the systems aren't connected, they can't enter checkout. But that's expected. These two systems in an ideal world are always connected together. In a worst case scenario, there's an unexpected outage on your commerce platform, and you want your site to at least still be usable, but not totally functional. And then there's that middle case of every once in a while our API drops out, like, once an hour for a second or something. In that case, you want your site to still be usable. You don't want your user experience to be impacted, and you still want you want the two systems to be able to recover from that 1 second outage every hour and continue on through checkout without the user being aware of it. So that's really, even though this is an edge case, it's an edge case that really has to be thought through and planned for. And this brings me to my first implementation tip. So as we go through these slides, I'm going to kind of call out some tips that I've learned through implementing headless systems, and hopefully they save you a lot of pain and time, because all these have been learned through blood, sweat, and tears. So implementation tip number 1 is write a health checker and notification checker, or notification for your connection between Drupal and your commerce system. And for dev and stage, make the notification that you get a banner on every page, because you don't want to do a deployment and then have a tester go into dev and say nothing works, and then find out once they open 40 tickets that nothing worked because the two systems weren't connected together, right? Make sure everybody who's doing testing on dev and stage know the state of the system and know to report that it's not connected if they're expecting it to be connected. And then it also goes for production. You probably don't want to do like a full page banner display, but write an endpoint and be able to monitor it through like New Relic or some other monitoring service to know when your systems are not connected and if you need to take any action to correct that. So that's the first implementation tip. Going on to our next architecture consideration. The Commerce API itself and the usage and flexibility of it. Is the Commerce API fully featured for headless use? What are the API usage limits? Does it support querying? Will the business logic fit within existing endpoints? I've never built a commerce site that didn't have custom business logic that had to be exposed in one way or another to a customer. So just make sure that the customizations you need to write fit within the endpoints, or the next one, that you can write custom endpoints. It's an extremely important consideration to have. And then if for this commerce platform, is there a PHP SDK, or is there a library available, or are you going to be writing your own API? All good things to know. Are there webhooks, or will you be polling for updates? Just general considerations, because everything between the two systems will be done through this API. You need to know the limitations and what to architect around before you really start getting into your integration. And the next consideration is data ownership. This is something that should be established before any code is ever written, is figuring out what system owns what data. So generally, users are owned by the commerce system. The commerce system is an identity provider for users, unless the business already has another identity provider in place, like some type of, I don't know, user portal or online user access system that does the identity provider for their current e-commerce solution, something like that. And then, orders, carts, products, product attributes, all of that data is also owned by commerce, as well as inventory. You don't want to be modifying or customizing that in Drupal. But things like content and catalog structure, content's definitely owned by Drupal. And what's content versus what's data, or what's content versus what's commerce data, is also an interesting discussion for products, because there can be a lot of overlap there. And sometimes like products have metadata, but they lack really rich content data. And that content can then be added in Drupal to a product. And then catalog structure, if your commerce system has a catalog, great, use it. If not, maybe that's something you have to add in Drupal to really get what you want. And implementation tip number 2, respect the decisions you make here and respect them always. Do not make any exceptions. And I really view this as, when you do your integration, you can manipulate data from the commerce system. You can manipulate it to make it fit within Drupal, but never customize it. And by that, I mean never significantly change the data that comes through, right? If something comes in as red and really the business wants it to display as burgundy on the front end, then that's a commerce data issue. Even though it's like 30 seconds to write an if statement in Drupal, don't customize your data. Always correct it in the right system, in the system that owns it. And that brings us to our next tip, which is make friends with all the teams. So because you have 2 systems, it's pretty likely that you're going to have 2 architects at least, if not more. And just make sure you're friendly with everybody. You have the communication channels, and you have that working relationship where if something needs to be corrected, you can get it corrected in the place it needs to be corrected, instead of doing a workaround or doing a customization on Drupal, because that's just going to create more technical debt and make the integration more complicated versus correcting it at the source. So just be friendly with people, make sure that if you have a small ask, you can go ask them, and you know the process, and you have the procedures in place to correct everything. Next, all right, so that's the last architecture consideration. Now we're going to get into the possible architectures after we've taken all these considerations into place. The first one is doing a fully headless implementation. So this is Drupal serves a page, and then let's say this is a product detail page where you have your header, and on the top right you have your cart, and then you have some product content, and then you have this bigger green box is your add to cart, your pricing, your variation selection, and then your footer or more content, whatever, with Drupal. So on fully headless, and this is fully headless commerce, not fully headless Drupal. And fully headless commerce, Drupal doesn't really know anything about the commerce system at all. And really, you're just using JavaScript to render different parts of the commerce platform on a Drupal page. This is possible if your commerce platform has a strong headless offering, and if it has customer authentication for the API. If you have an integration user, you can't do this architecture, because it requires exposing the commerce API directly to the customer. So that's fully headless. Obviously, we're not going to talk about this because it's not the topic of the session. The next one is partially headless. So this is similar to the last one, but we've decided that the product details, we really want those to live in Drupal, right? We want to be able to search with them through Solr. We want to be able to reference the products as products in our content. So we want to be able to build a paragraph that has a grid of 3 products. So we need to import those products into Drupal, and then Drupal will handle displaying those products. But our cart and our checkout are still going to be headless. And that's all still going to be driven by our commerce platform. Once again, you need a commerce platform with a strong headless offering, as well as customer authentication. And then really it's just the cart and the checkout for this architecture would be driven by the commerce platform. And the content and products would be viewed as content that's imported from the commerce system into Drupal and displayed by Drupal. The next possible architecture is what I'm going to call full commerce integration. In this one, you have your commerce platform, and then you have Drupal Commerce, Centauro, and then you have Drupal that's responsible for displaying all of it. So in this one, you're really taking data out of your commerce platform, shoving it into Drupal Commerce, and then just using Drupal Commerce's functionality and display methods and cart and checkout to allow the user to do the e-commerce, add to cart, product search, all that good stuff. So this one is great because if your commerce platform does not have a strong API or headless offering, or it recommends using an integration user instead of customer authentication, then there's a lot more flexibility in your PHP backend to work around API limitations around getting data into Drupal, and then letting Drupal Commerce really handle exposing that data to the user, regardless of the limitations you actually have with your commerce platform API. And the next one, so this is more of a thought experiment, but I can see as Drupal Commerce expands its commerce API functionality, I could see a really strong argument to be made for taking a commerce platform that doesn't necessarily have a great API, moving the data into Drupal Commerce, and doing content in Drupal, and then doing a fully headless Drupal site, right? So like a Drupal site that has a headless site using Reactor Node that is using or leveraging Drupal Commerce's APIs, but all the data and all the business logic is still being driven by that backend commerce platform that is now 2 layers deep instead of 1 layer. I think this is a really interesting use case for the future, and I think it's only going to get better as Drupal Commerce gets more API friendly. Those are the 4 really architectures for headless commerce and Drupal as the head in headless commerce. We're going to go with number 3, which is doing the full commerce integration, because it really leverages Drupal's Drupal Commerce's unique data model. It really supports even the most underwhelming commerce platform API. So that's what we're going to look at. All right, so we've got our architecture. We're going to do a full commerce integration. Now we're going to look into integration considerations and approaches for individual parts of the site. Like, how do you build a robust integration for the cart or for pricing or for products? And what do you want to do and what do you want to consider there? So this all comes down to data. How often does data change? Why do you need that data? When do you need that data? And who owns the data, right? So the answers to these questions are really going to determine how often you need to fetch the data, how important it is that it's accurate, and like what areas you actually need it in. And if you can once you answer all these questions, it'll be obvious what integration approach to use to really keep your integration logical and performant and secure. So the first integration approach is import or one-way sync. This is going to be really the slowest and it's going to be the slowest, and for data that is mostly static. For an import, all the data, like you're bringing data out of the commerce platform and you're importing it into the Drupal data model. So you're bringing products in as products, you're bringing product attributes in as product attributes. For accounts, I'm not talking about users here, I'm talking about like business accounts or company accounts. Really more of a B2B feature. But this is stuff that's just, it's not going to change that often, but it's also stuff that Drupal is going to use all the time. And it's going to show up a lot, and you're going to be querying for a lot, and you don't want to take the performance hit of going out to the commerce platform every time you need this information. And it's just not that important for it to be fetched on demand, because it's not going to change, right? Things like a product SKU aren't going to change randomly. So don't do a call for that every time, just import it once. And to implement this, I highly recommend doing a message queue system where either the commerce platform pushes messages to Drupal through an endpoint, or Drupal pulls like the product data or the data out of the commerce platform and then schedules individual jobs for individual pieces of the data, like individual products. This is the most scalable solution in the long term, because you're processing each product as an individual job instead of, writing some custom class that does a query out and then imports 500 products at once. That's not very scalable. You're going to run into issues eventually. And it also allows you to have a job fail and to continue processing additional jobs. It's an all-around flexible system, and I highly advise doing this kind of approach through like Ultimate Cron or Advanced Queue in Drupal, instead of doing one big God method or God class to handle your imports. And I have experimented using Migrate to do this. I would say use it at your own caution, because commerce data is complicated and there's a lot of relations. And unless you're a Migrate wizard and the team that's going to be maintaining your site are Migrate wizards, the migration just gets really complicated really fast, and it's not nearly as straightforward as just reading PHP that's manipulating data that's going in and coming out. And that brings us to our next implementation tip. And this applies to all the integration approaches. This just happens to be our first one that we're looking at. Don't fail silently, log everything. So every time you make an API call, wrap it in a try catch. And in that catch statement, have a logger, have a log message. If you're failing silently, it just means that you don't know what's wrong with your system, or you don't know what the exceptions are in your data, or you don't know what your customers are experiencing or doing. So never leave a situation where something can fail and throw an exception and you don't catch it. It's extremely important, especially because these systems are semi-organic, right? With a dev, a stage, and a prod, you have 3 environments, and well, really you have 6 environments, because you have a commerce and a Drupal environment for each dev, stage, and prod. And that means things can be different in all of them, and you need to be able to know what's different when. So don't fail silently, log everything. There's a really useful trait, I believe it's the logger aware channel trait, where you can use it in any class and it injects the logger service for you instead of having to do the whole dependency injection route. That's all I have to say about that. The next one is import and export, or two-way sync. And my answer to this one is don't do this. And by this, I mean don't have the two systems actively manipulating the same data and expecting the other system to know about it. So like if Drupal is doing something with the cart and your commerce system is doing something with your cart, and you're expecting Drupal to know about what the commerce system is doing with the cart, you end up in a very cyclical, you don't know who actually owns that data and why they own it. So even though all the approaches I'm about to talk about are actually two-way syncs, you never want to get into a situation where where both systems are acting independently of each other. You always want to think about it as one system is acting, the next system is interpreting that action, and then the original system is reacting to the response. Never get into a situation where they're acting independently. The next approach is lazy load. So this is useful for data that you want to store in Drupal, but is not, you don't need it until you need it, right? It's like you don't need to load every user. You probably do not need to load every user into Drupal. You just need the users that are going to log into your system. So lazy load them. And the same, coupons are another example where like Drupal doesn't need to know about every coupon in the system. It only needs to know about the ones that people are trying to apply and people are trying to use. So in general, like if you can lazy load it, then lazy load it. It's convenient. For this, the general approach is usually a storage override or subscribers. For users, this is like if you're using an external authentication method already, this is a fairly standard thing for OAuth and Simple SAML. There's the external auth module, which handles linking or creating new users, registering users, all that good stuff, as well as bringing data over for the user. So use the external auth module if you're using users. But for other entities, especially Drupal commerce entities, you're probably going to have to override the entity storage provider to make it lazy load based off the commerce platform data instead of referencing the Drupal database. And that brings us to our next implementation tip. Make sure you can debug on production. So because you have data coming in randomly and you're not loading it all at once so you can monitor it, if you have an issue in an environment, make sure you can debug on that environment without doing a deployment, because there's really nothing worse than sitting on a call with the business owners. I mean, like, well, we know this isn't working, but we have to do a deployment in order to figure out why it's not working. So just make sure you can enable debugging on production. A good example of this is an API I've worked with recently. When something failed on the API side, the response you got back was essentially such and such failed, and then turn on debugging to view more information, which is great, except for if you're in production and debugging is not turned on because you want your site to be performant. And their answer to that is, well, send a debug parameter in your API call, and then we'll send you everything back. That's also great. That's useful, except all your API calls are hard coded in your PHP classes, and you can't change that without doing a deployment. So what I did is, in that integration, there's a debug submodule, which when it's turned on, it injects that debug parameter to all the API calls that the integration makes. So even though all of our users will have a will notice a performance impact when that's on, it allows me to debug production without doing a deployment and to get all the data I need to correct the issue without having to always take the performance impact and without having to do the deployment out to production. So just make sure you know how you can turn on debugging without doing deployments. All right, the next method, on demand. So this is for on demand, could also be called headless. This is really for data that Drupal has no need to know about or no need to care about. So for order history, that's pretty obvious. Like, there's no reason to load in all your past orders into the Drupal head if you can write a custom block that does an API call out to your commerce platform and just returns all the orders for that user. That's a whole bunch of data you don't have to worry about importing into Drupal if you can just do the query on demand and display it in a block and be done with it. And I've actually taken it a step further in that in checkout, the cart, once it transitions to an order, I have the opinion that Drupal should not care about that order ever. So even on the order confirmation page, all that data is pulled through a query from the commerce platform, because that way it's always accurate. It's one less failure point, and it's one less integration point I have to care about. So even on order confirmation, just pull it all in. And then there's also things like shipping methods and inventory. Inventory is fairly obvious in that the commerce platform obviously maintains inventory, and that's a very dynamic thing. So if you have to display inventory status, you want to be fetching that as necessary and not storing in Drupal, not letting Drupal determine if something is in stock or not, but having Drupal reference out to the commerce platform for it to tell you that. And shipping methods are actually an interesting example in that with a commerce system, there's integrations out to other systems, right? Like your shipping providers or your payment providers or taxes. And the question is, do you maintain separate integrations on the head, which is Drupal, or do you maintain integrations with Drupal as the head and in the commerce platform as separate integrations? Or are there endpoints available to tell you that what shipping methods are available for a cart? In the most recent site I worked on, the shipping methods were available through the commerce platform. So I didn't have to maintain like a UPS or a FedEx integration. I just called out to the API to say what shipping methods are available for this cart, and I got them back, which is very convenient. But for payment methods, that doesn't work. So for payment methods, you have to maintain two integrations because you have to collect the credit card information on the front end and tokenize it, and then send that token out to the commerce platforms because you can never have that credit card hit your server. So this is one of those ones where, depending on the platform and use, there might be an on-demand one, or you might have to write a totally separate integration and keep the two in sync for like UPS and FedEx. And really, mostly for approach-wise, like most of these are custom blocks or event subscribers or just custom plugins within Drupal Commerce. So for like the shipping method one, I wrote a custom shipping method plugin that just queries out to the commerce platform and gets back to shipping methods. And then Drupal Commerce treats it as any other shipping method, the same as FedEx or UPS, and just displays it. And that brings us to the next implementation tip, which is if you're loading it lazily or on demand, you should be able to delete it from Drupal. Like Drupal should not care about this data at all. And if you delete it, nothing bad should happen. It shouldn't delete things on the remote system. It shouldn't just fail to load it. It shouldn't need to be told that it exists, because Drupal, the integration should be able to tell, oh, I need to load this now that it's been requested. And it should be able to load it successfully without any prior knowledge that it existed or without any prior data loading. So just keep that in mind. Don't get into the trap where like you lazily load or you do an on-demand load of your order history, but when you display the order details, you're referencing Drupal Commerce product entities, because that's no longer decoupled. You're now tying your order details to the products in Drupal. And what if like you have an order that's 3 years old and that product is no longer offered and there's nothing to reference? Then you have an issue because you don't have data in Drupal that you need to display that order detail, even though you shouldn't really need that data if your query is, if your query to the commerce platform is correct. So that's just one consideration, is just make sure that if you're doing things lazily or on demand, you're actually separating out concerns and not tying the two together accidentally. And the last integration method, second to last integration method, is transactional. These are simple API calls where like you send data out and you get a response. It's usually true or false, or success or failure, or here's the tax or here's the price. These are just simple, happen all the time, right? User authentication, user logged in, password was right or wrong. Checkout, usually for checkout, the steps are a validation step between cart and checkout to make sure you can enter checkout, and then let Drupal Commerce handle all the checkout steps and collecting all the information. And then after order review, doing a place transition from the Drupal system out to the remote system. And then, was that place successful or not? And does the user need to collect more data? And then, things like taxes, you send the order out, you get the tax for the order back, and you add it as an adjustment to the Drupal Commerce order. And then pricing for products. Drupal Commerce has this great concept of resolvers, which are plugins. So they have a price resolver, which uses Drupal plugins. So if you want to do pricing with your remote system, you write a price resolver plugin that just makes the API calls out as needed. And then anytime you display a price as calculated, it displays that on, or anytime you do a calculated price in Drupal Commerce, it runs through these resolvers and your API calls are made to get the right price from the remote system. All right, that is transactional. And then synchronization. So this is probably the most complicated one, and this is the two-way sync technically that I said don't do, but it can't be avoided. And it's okay as long as, like I said, you maintain that act, interpret, react, and not a cyclical act, react, act between both systems. So like for profile data, the commerce system owns the user's profile data, but Drupal as the head is responsible for collecting new information. So you have to import the data from the commerce system to Drupal, and then you have to return that. Well, you have to import it to Drupal. You have to let the user modify it, and then you have to send any updates out to the remote system. So even though that's, import, export, it's a very direct import it, present it, change it, export it. It's not the commerce system changes something, Drupal knows about that change, user updates something, and then you have two changes to worry about. It's not that type of deal. And the cart's another one. If you're maintaining a Drupal cart and a remote, well, if Drupal Commerce is maintaining the presentation of the cart, and you had the commerce system is maintaining the state of the cart, then when you do add to cart in Drupal, Drupal has to fire off an add to cart to your commerce platform and see if that was successful or not, and then act correctly. And that's keeping the two carts in sync. Address book and payment methods, that's just data that you need to import and then present during checkout so the user can use it. And if they update it, then you need to send that information out, just like profile data. So typically this is done with subscribers and entity hooks on the actual entity operations, such as like pre-save, update, delete, that kind of stuff. And external entities. So this one is once again a thought experiment. I haven't gotten a chance to implement it, but I think there's a really strong use case for standard data or data that is fairly standardized and is never needed outside of an on-demand situation. So that's for things like address book and payment methods, where that data always has to be correct. It always has to be accurate. It always has to be available. But Drupal really has no need to know that information, because the only time you display it is on a user profile page or during checkout. And if Drupal doesn't need to know about it, why write an import process for it if you can override the storage handler and just import it to Drupal as an internal entity that's really stored elsewhere? So this is an interesting one where it's a complex solution that ultimately simplifies the other integrations, because you're not having to worry about import and export and API updates if you're just writing directly out to your remote system. All right, that is all the integration approaches. I'm going to walk through kind of an example on a product detail page here now, just to kind of show you just how many API calls you can all right, I guess how many integration points you can really have on what seems like a simple interaction. So let's say that a user is on a PDP page and they decide to log in. So they're going to go from anonymous to authenticated. The first one is there's an SSO transactional call to authenticate the user. Simple enough. Next, you're going to load that profile data or that user data through synchronization, because you're pulling the data out from the commerce platform and into Drupal so that's available. But if that user doesn't exist in Drupal already, then you have to do the lazy load to retrieve that information and then do the profile load. So you have a lazy load in there for certain situations. And then you finally end up on the product detail page. And once you're there, you're gonna have a transactional call to price any products on the page, because now they're authenticated and you can't use the base price. You have to use their user pricing if you have it. You're gonna have a synchronization call for the cart state. what if that anonymous user had a cart and what if the anonymous user had a cart and then once they logged in, they already had a cart? How do you reconcile the two? Not only like between the two carts, but between the two systems as well. And then, if they hit add to cart on this product detail page, you have to send an update out to the remote system to update that cart. And then if you're doing inventory, if you're displaying inventory on the cart page or on the product detail page, that's going to be an on-demand call to see if it's in stock, and if not, what do I do about it? How do I change the display of this page? And maybe that's because the anonymous user did not have a store selected, and once they logged in, they have a default store. So now you're doing inventory calls on this page. And then there's probably a product access check too, especially like if you have additional B2B offerings or variations available to certain authentication users. Are those available now? That's a transactional call. So even though a user logging in and going to the same page that they're already on can seem simple, there's a lot of data that can change once they log in. Like most of these calls don't need to be made for the anonymous user. Actually, let's walk through that. So for an anonymous user, the product pricing call doesn't need to be made because you can store an anonymous price in Drupal Commerce. So there's no API call there. Cart state, you're still maintaining a cart state for the anonymous user if they have a cart. So that one would still exist. Inventory depends on what you're doing with inventory. I can see displaying inventory for an anonymous user as well. So this one probably exists. Product access, you can maintain the product access for an anonymous user in Drupal itself. It's the B2B uses that you want to make sure to capture in an API call. So really, we've cut out 2 to 3 calls, and we might just be, for an anonymous user, we might just be maintaining the state. And for an authenticated user, we might have to deal with all of these different integration points. So that's just kind of an example of what all could be going on a page. There's certainly more complex examples, like what's going on with the cart page or the checkout page. But this seemed like a good walkthrough. And a reminder, implementation tip number 2, respect data ownership. Even though it's tempting to customize your data, don't do it, because each one of these blue clouds represents, if you make a data customization, by that I mean you get data from your remote system and you import it, but you change that value during import or during the API call response. Each one of these blue clouds represents a point where you have to maintain that customization, or you potentially have to maintain that customization. Whereas if the data is correct, you don't have to worry about it because you just know you're getting the data correctly from the remote system. So just keep that in mind. Do not customize your data because there's so many integration points that you end up having to duplicate your customization all over the place, and it just becomes a mess to maintain. And with that, I am done. Have any questions? All right, I see there's some chat going on.
So to contextualize, my question there was actually about your remote entities.
Yeah. All right, Chris. Sorry, I'm not seeing the question.
Oh, I think I'm the last one in
Oh,
chat.
here we go. All right. Can't you just do this as cache data locally with webhook for invalidation and then get it re-retrieved from source? Yeah. I mean, if your commerce platform supports webhooks and you have that capability to do an invalidation from the remote system out. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess like I've seen a lot of people try to do remote entities over the years with various levels of success. And so I was just kind of curious what your take on it was. I mean, I've also done similar things where we don't even have an entity. We just do the API calls and cache it in the render layer with appropriate tags.
Yeah,
And that's just, but you can't do views data or things like that on that. So
I would definitely not want to do that with the current Drupal 8 implementation. And that's really why you need the entity in the first place, is just to make it easier to work with in Drupal Commerce. So, I mean, right now, I usually do like a CRUD operation where we import and export them as they update. It's annoying to maintain, but it's a lot simpler than external entities. All right, scrolling up. All right, looks like Matt answers Benji's question about migrate API, I don't know, about disconnected behavior. So disconnected behavior is important because networks are not always reliable, and you want to be able to recover from any failure state that you run into. Migrate API, I touched on, Benji. I'm not sure if you're happy with my answer.
I like getting your honest answer.
Yeah. No, I have tried to build the migrate import process, and I found it just wasn't maintainable for more junior developers. It wasn't obvious. All right, if there's no other questions, then I will remind you about providing feedback.
I have one more question for you, Kyle.
All right.
In all of this, what was like the biggest challenge, like the biggest singular challenge that, or that thing that rears its head over and over again?
Caching. So, because to minimize, well, was it caching? I think, yeah, it's either caching or we had some problems with the I've had some problems with checkout APIs. So caching is mostly around just making sure you're invalidating correctly for like pricing. Because in a system where you're importing the products and then resolving the price and caching that, so you don't always have to resolve it every time a page loads, you have to make sure you invalidate it correctly. And then with a commerce platform that doesn't have webhooks to send out invalidation events, you have to make sure that your cache is short enough to catch any changes, and also any actions that the user takes on the front end that should invalidate caches actually does.
Thanks.
All right, and I see Catherine posted the link to feedback. That'd be much appreciated. And a reminder about contribution day tomorrow, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Central. I think, yes, there'll be a training as well from 10 a.m. to noon. So if you haven't contributed, I highly encourage it. I will probably be there to help do some commerce work for Matt. It's always a great time. I'm sure it'll be a bit different virtually, but we'll see how it goes.